The last tissue we will look at in this lab is the adrenal gland. And we, once again, are going to start from that macroscopic view, showing the whole thing, and then we will zoom in and look at the different layers. So overall, our adrenal glands are going to sit on top of our kidneys. So we'll see them again when we talk about the urinary system. They're a pair of glands, so we have one on above each kidney. And they're going to have an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So this is where the histology starts. So what we have here is one adrenal gland. On the outside, we have this cortex. So like I've mentioned in previous labs, whenever we see cortex and medulla, cortex is always going to be that outer layer, and the medulla is always going to be that middle or deeper layer, essentially. I say middle because medulla starts with an M, and that can make it a little easier to remember. Additionally, when you're looking at a slide, you may also see this fibrous capsule here. This is a little capsule of connective tissue, most likely dense irregular, but we're not too concerned about that for today. And that's just a fibrous outer coating to help protect these inner layers. So we have cortex and medulla. Now the cortex is where things get really interesting. So you will talk about this in lecture, but we have 3 zones of the adrenal cortex. So we're still in that outermost layer. The zones are going to be called zona, so Z-O-N-A, and we're going to have a zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and a zona reticularis. So each of those is a mouthful. So we will start from the outside and work our way in. Now, right now we're in the Human Protein Atlas, but I am also going to switch over to the Yale site because they have some really helpful breakdowns of each zone. The outermost zone is going to be our zona glomerulosa. So we'll go ahead, let our microscope do the navigating here. So right away, we can see some differences in color and texture between the zones of our cortex. So that first outermost zone is zona glomerulosa, just deep to that fibrous capsule. So got capsule here. And then right away we can see we've got kind of this recurring pattern where we've got these like clusters of cells. And in between we're going to have some lines, essentially. This is extra information, but we have structures called trabeculae, which are just like little invaginations of that outer capsule layer. So that's what we're seeing here, creating this kind of vertical line pattern that we see. And in between, we have our cells of the zona glomerulosa. Now, the hormone that is produced in this zone is going to be something called a mineralocorticoid. Mineralocorticoids are affecting ion balance. So one example is aldosterone. This is a mineralocorticoid that is maintaining salt and water balance in the body. So all really important things. They're actually going to work together with our kidneys in that sense. But that's all extra information. So what you need to know for the lab exam is you want to know your cortex from your medulla and know your 3 zones. So let's keep going with that. The middle layer, or the middle zone, is going to be our zona fasciculata. So this guy, if we compare the color, it's a little darker, and if we compare the texture, I might have to zoom in a little bit, we have cells with a lot of cytoplasm. So up top, this is zona glomerulosa. We're moving down, start to see that these cells appear a little bigger, and there's more space in between the nuclei, and that means there's more cytoplasm and the cells are a little more spread out. As we keep moving down, we will encounter that other zone. Okay, so we are now in our zona reticularis. This is even darker, so we're heading towards a dark pink, dark purple stain with the zona reticularis, and the cells are a little more clustered together. And pattern-wise, we don't really see a pattern here. They're kind of scattered more randomly throughout this zone. So as we zoom out, hopefully you can start to pick out those patterns where zona reticularis is going to be that darkest layer, fasciculata is that middle layer where the cells have a little more space in between, and then glomerulosa is where we have those clusters of lighter stained cells separated by those vertical trabeculae. Now, I think the Yale site does a really good job breaking apart these zones. So just to review, we're going to go through each zone in a little more detail here. So we're going to start from this macroscopic view. We're still within that adrenal cortex, and we're going to start back at that outermost layer, zona glomerulosa. So this is slightly more zoomed in, and there's a couple more features that we can see here, but let's orient ourselves first. Zona glomerulosa is just deep to the capsule, that layer of fibrous connective tissue. We have these vertical lines running. They're basically a continuation of the capsule into that zone. So these are our trabeculae. And then we still have that pattern here where we've got clusters of cuboidal cells. They're clustering together, creating little tubes or more of a rectangular blob here. So when we see that pattern, that tells us this is our zona glomerulosa. Next up is that middle layer, zona fasciculata. So we're going to switch gears. Right away, we can see we've got a different color change here. So slightly more pink. And let's also look at the dispersion of cells here. These cells have a lot more cytoplasm. So each of the little purple circles you see is a nucleus. The lighter pink stuff around it is cytoplasm and cell membrane. So these cells are more spread out. And function-wise, they are producing glucocorticoids. One example of a glucocorticoid that most people are familiar with is cortisol, or stress hormone, as it's sometimes called. So this zone is important for things like regulating our stress response. Cortisol is responsible for our sympathetic stress response. It's also going to affect things like metabolism, our blood pressure. We all know when we're stressed that our blood pressure will increase. And also things like blood sugar and inflammation will be affected by those glucocorticoids. So that is all within this middle layer, the zona fasciculata. And then lastly, as we move deeper, we're now into that zona reticularis. Now this zone is typically the darkest stained. It's deepest, it's darkest stained, it's right next to our medulla. And we don't have as many patterns to pick out here. The cells are scattered more randomly. So we still have our purple nuclei, and then we're going to have pink cytoplasm and cell membrane, but we can't tell apart the cells as easily in the zone. So it's a little more random scattering versus a pattern that we can pick out. Function-wise, our zona reticularis has cells that produce sex hormones. So we're producing androgens, things that will affect the development of male characteristics or the lack of them and the absence of androgen. And we will get to sex hormones in more detail when we get to the reproductive tract. So right now, this is kind of extra information that we can use to help identify these zones. In terms of the medulla, so let's switch back to our human protein atlas now. Not too much to see in that innermost medulla. We basically have just a repeating pattern of lots and lots of cells called chromuffin cells. Now, the function of the medulla is to store and produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so these are the main hormones responsible for our fight or flight response. And so they're going to have great effects on heart rate, our resting metabolism, blood pressure, vasoconstriction, all things that we would expect to experience in a sympathetic fight or flight response. So I know that was a lot. Let's go ahead and regroup and talk about the most important stuff to know for the adrenal gland. So from a larger view, maybe a 4x magnification, you want to be able to tell your cortex from your medulla. So the cortex is going to be that outermost, almost like a crust. So you can think C for cortex, C for crust. Medulla is the deeper layer. Medulla is where we're producing that epinephrine and norepinephrine. As we zoom in and focus on that adrenal cortex, we will start to see our three layers. And right now you may not be able to tell them apart at all. That's okay. You may have to rewatch this video a couple times to start picking out those layers. But we have that outermost layer being the zona glomerulosa, where we have that repeating pattern where we have clusters of cells separated by the trabeculae, those little fibrous divisions. That's going to be that outermost layer of the cortex. We have our deeper layer being the zona fasciculata. So we have a color change here where it's getting a little darker. As we zoom in, we can start to see that pattern change. So now we're getting more into sparsely dispersed cells. So we've got our nuclei in purple, a lot of cytoplasm around those nuclei. And then our last zone is closest to the medulla. It's also the darkest. So we're now getting into dark pink, sometimes dark purple. The pattern has disappeared. So these cells are more randomly distributed throughout the zona reticularis. Okay, I hope this helps. Lab 18 is very histology heavy. So this is an area where you'll want to spend time with the microscopes in class. You may have to watch these videos more than once, but I hope this helps you to prepare for lab exam 2.